Joining me this coming Sunday, the 5th of February 2023, is Suzanne Du Toit, executive producer, director, and writer, who will be talking about her upcoming documentary, Revolution.
It was 1994. We were finally free. We reclaimed the street and gave birth to a new urban culture. We called it Kwaito, Baba. But beyond our world, no one was listening, calling us the lost generation, youth who had sought liberation before education. Despite this, we believed in our voice. We needed to be heard, and we needed a platform. We found it in a radio station.
Okay, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are across the globe. Welcome to On the Sofa with Esther. I've changed my hairstyle over the past 2 weeks, so this sort of beehive gets in the way, but it definitely is me. Anyway, ladies and gents, I have the absolute privilege and pleasure of interviewing Suzanne Du Toit, of having her on my platform. We've been trying to get this done for quite a while, but it's a real privilege because I know that you're going to enjoy this interview. It's a little different from the interviews that I do with like legends and pioneers actually in the music industry, but Suzanne is doing a documentary. She's working on a documentary, and she's also just shared that she's also got funding for it, to more funding. So, I'm going to put you out of your misery and just ask Suzanne my question in terms of who is Suzanne in a nutshell, in a peanut shell and a crab shell, because we got to celebrate. Who is Suzanne Du Toit?
So I am creative. I mean, I don't want to call myself a filmmaker until my film is done.
But you've started it, so you've got to claim that.
Yes, no. So I mean, I am a producer, executive producer, director, writer. I mean, I come from a writing background. I'm currently a creative director. I also work in advertising. So I do have all that brand building background.
Excellent. Excellent. It will come in handy, trust me, for your film, your documentary. Yeah. Excellent. And so today we're going to be talking about your upcoming, and we have to say upcoming film documentary, and it's called Why Revolution. And I'm just going to read a brief around that. So in 1997, at the age of 17, Suzanne became obsessed with a radio station called YFM. So her documentary is set against the birth of South Africa's new democracy, a tale of how a group of young, ambitious South Africans came together to launch the country's first independent youth radio station. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to play her trailer, and then we're going to go over to talking to Suzanne to find out more about this.
It was 1994. We were finally free. We reclaimed the street and gave birth to a new urban culture. We called it Kwaito, Baba. But beyond our world, no one was listening, calling us the lost generation, youth who had sought liberation before education. Despite this, we believed in our voice. We needed to be heard, and we needed a platform. We found it in a radio station.
Mm. In itself, it's very powerful on so many levels. So, Suzanne, over to you. Why did you choose to do a documentary called The White Revolution? And especially it looks at different, I would say, aspects of not just coming through apartheid, but also the music and then rebellion. And I do like the statement when it says liberation. They chose liberation before education.
Mm.
So over to you, Suzanne.
Yeah, I mean, it's been quite an interesting journey, because as I said, I'm not from a filmmaking background. But I mean, I think at the time when I started working on the film, I saw an opportunity to, create local stories that are of an international and global standard. I think like, a lot of South African productions maybe don't have that edge that I think, maybe global standards or what I've kind of been exposed to as a creative director in advertising. My experience in that. So, I mean, in terms of the story itself, it goes way back for me, because I would say when just after Nelson Mandela was released, which was around 91, the end of 91, 92, I moved up with my mom to Johannesburg. So I'm originally from Cape Town.
Okay.
And then, I mean, at the time, it was very much still segregated. Even Cape Town itself. Like, if I describe apartheid Cape Town, it's a very different place from what it is now, I would say. Although some areas are still pretty much kind of the same, probably worse, especially the areas that I came up in. So we moved to Joburg. I mean, this was after my parents got divorced. So I moved up with my mom and my siblings, and we moved from Cape Town into what was, the inner city of Joburg. An area called Hillbrow. I don't know how familiar you guys are with Hillbrow, but I mean, it does have.
I've heard of it in conversations. It pops up quite a lot because I was in South Africa in August where I met you.
Yes.
And it popped up. So if you could just tell us a little bit about the history of
the area.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, Hillbrow does have a bit of a notorious kind of reputation in that, there's always these stories about crime and stuff. But I mean, in terms of the area itself, when we moved up into the inner city, it was a time where there was this white flight. So a lot of white people were moving out of the city and trying to like get away because, Nelson Mandela was going to be president and the ANC was going to take over. So they saw this, the future of the country basically being almost, not a space for them. That's kind of like the thoughts that they had. So we moved into Hillbrow and everyone was kind of moving out. But I mean, again, coming from an apartheid background, someone who was living in communities that were very segregated, not having been exposed to Black culture and all the different Black cultures that exist in SA, and even white people and all the white cultures that exist in SA. Now I'm, as a teenager going into a city, living in a high-rise building, which is something that we were never kind of allowed to do. Walking.
Why? You were never allowed to live in high-rise buildings because.
Yes, I mean, like living in the inner city for people of color and Black people were not allowed during apartheid. So we had our own areas where we were basically living outside of the city. And I mean, I would say about most communities of color would live at least between 30 and 40 minutes outside of the city. So you were only traveling in there to work. And then you would leave at night and go back to your hood.
Wow.
Yeah. And obviously, as someone of color now living in an area where now there are Black people, there are white people, and Hillbrow and the surrounding areas had always been, those areas where people were already mixing even during apartheid. So, I mean, it was a complete culture shock, firstly, living in the inner city. And then, going to a school that had just been opened up. So they had these former white schools only. And then when Nelson Mandela was released, and this was even before legislation was put in place, because everything was basically being demolished in the lead up to 1994. you know, I mean, they had like, I mean, white people just had the best thing. So these schools were then opened up to people of color, and you know, I would consider myself as part of that first generation that then gained access to these former white schools.
What's that like, Suzanne? You know, compared to what you had been used to, what were some of
Yeah.
the privileges that you were able to maybe take part in now that you were allowed to go into these environments?
So I mean, the schools were amazing. We're talking about schools that have history of like well over 100 years. I mean, there are quite a few schools like that in Johannesburg in particular. I mean, all over in all of the major cities. So I mean, I went to a school that had quite a bit of history already behind it.
Okay.
And I mean, so I went to the girls' school, and the boys' school, there was like a lot of kids that would then go on and play for their national teams. And I mean, those are the kind of things that as people of color and Black people, you didn't have access to. You had your own teams that you play in your own like little, you know, colored communities, Black communities, but you were never able to access, you know, those great standards, the great coaching, the great everything, you know. I mean, I think I told you the story of how moving from Cape Town, which is a coastal city, I actually learned how to swim in Joburg. I learned how to swim in Johannesburg because the school had a pool. I mean, when we got there, I was just like, oh my God, the facilities are off the roof. So, I mean, a pool. I mean, they had the normal kind of sports that we would play, which is netball and soccer, but there was stuff that was way beyond that. So like debating. I mean, my sister was 2 years behind me. She was able to then join the junior city council. I mean, these are things that we were never able to access. I mean, even for myself, I mean, I took part in school plays, but I mean, the type of, you know, resources that they had at the school itself was insane. And I mean, a lot of the history, and even basic things like the school uniform. I mean, we never wore blazers and hats, and it was very English. I can tell you that. You can see a lot of the history of the UK coming through in the schools. So, I mean, even that type of thing, you know, when you now move on to high school, you've got all this access to these privileges. And also things like, I mean, I then became like the editor of the newspaper. Yeah, we had a school newspaper. I mean, those kind of things we didn't really have, you know.
But then I guess if things like that means you have a voice.
Yes. Yeah.
And you're not supposed to have a voice. So, you know, having, like you talked about, places of debate, you know, the editor of a newspaper is about expression and, you know, have a voice. And so, you know, that's not going to happen in you know.
Yes, and I mean, there was a lot of like, and that's where these networks come in. So like, what I realized is like, you know, we were living in a bubble, or we were forced to live in a bubble in apartheid, because you never had access to all of these facilities, right? But then in terms of the networks itself, so I mean, these schools, because they have such a huge heritage, their networks span over generations. So even if you're participating in the debating club, you would be doing these inter-debates with other schools. I mean, those are the things that we never really were exposed to. I mean, even an inter-camp where we went on camp with other schools and you got to meet all the other, I mean, eventually became a prefect. So they had all of these, you know, milestones that you would move through as you went through high school, which never really existed for people of color and Black people, definitely not. Yeah.
So, you know, when you've spoken about the system and, you know, you've lived it, you've lived in it.
Yeah.
And you've lived at coming through it and out of it. And so I guess that was the huge influence of you doing this documentary, but
yes,
also,
absolutely.
Also with the music, because the documentary touches a lot on Kwaito, and that's a genre of music asked you to explain. But
yeah.
So if you could just explain the genre of music, but also what did that genre of music do for you personally?
So, I mean, even from a personal point of view, because I think, like, you know, when you talk about South Africans, and everyone is aware of our history being apartheid, you kind of just like get boxed into this history, you know. So I was still having a personal journey in that, you know, I started high school in Joburg. Yes, there were all of these changes happening around in the background, but I mean, my parents had just got divorced, and now I was becoming a teenager. I went to a girls' school, okay, no boys in the school anymore, which was like a huge shock for me as well. That's something that, you know, I kind of had to get used to. And then also just on the streets, I mean, coming from a very completely different city and now interacting in a very multicultural inner city, and going to a school where now you're in, you know, class with all these other cultures, you're being taught by white teachers, which is a thing, because I mean, coming from an apartheid background, you kind of like need to be submissive. When you know, you're in the vicinity of white people, and that started changing, because now, you know, you can kind of look them in the eye now, you know. But I mean, throughout this entire journey, and it was very exciting. I mean, as a teenager, you still have that, and you're young, you know, you still have this hopeful kind of feeling happening. I mean, I remember my school was, you know, one of the voting stations during the first democratic election. So we had to put up these posters, you know, and the teachers were very much involved with communicating that the fact, you know, that you could come there and vote, and there was a lot of voter education happening. So, I mean, you saw all these things happening around you, but also just my discovery of Joburg, coming from Cape Town, that soundtrack of Kwaito always being on the streets, like as you're going to school, you know, us listening to it in the classrooms, that type of thing. It will always be, you know, my soundtrack to Joburg. You know, and my coming of age story, if I can call it that, because throughout then high school, you know, you heard this music on the streets. I mean, as teenagers, you always kind of have the pulse of what's happening. You're living on the pulse of what's happening. So it was kind of that vibe. And then in my final year of high school, YFM then launched the genre, and that was around October. But my mom was a school teacher, so she was teaching in the same road as the building, like the building that YFM was in. So I was always hanging around the station trying to catch these DJs, you know, and get their autographs and, you know, that type of thing. So, I mean, there was still like that sense of like still being a teenager, you know, outside of this, outside of this history, this like very overwhelming history.
But it's interesting because the music in itself, and even what YFM stood for, even though you were in this history, but it was, that's why the Y Revolution is brilliant, because you're breaking out against that history as well. So there's that sort of juxtaposition of being in this, but then pushing against at the same time. Yes,
absolutely. And I think like, because YFM was so new and there was no radio station that was kind of playing stuff for youth, or, you know, talking the way youth spoke, and, you know, having the same age, like seeing a DJ who was like 18, kind of like the same age as you, and being able to like go to the radio station. I mean, they weren't bureaucratic at all. So, I mean, even as a fan, you could kind of try and get in there and like hang out with the people. They were very down to earth and accessible. But I mean, there was this cool factor, man, you know, you just wanted to touch it. Yeah. And it's like, you're always listening to the radio, always listening after the DJs and the songs. And I was always that kid trying to enter the competitions, you know, trying to get the CDs. And, you know, there was nothing like that before, for young people, and, you know, young people of color and Black people. And, there really wasn't anything like that before. So that's why there was all this kind of, you know, euphoria around it.
And it's interesting because the station was actually set up by a white South African.
Yes.
Which is interesting, once again, I use that word juxtaposition. But also in his own way, if I remember from our previous conversation, Suzanne, in his own way, he was like the black sheep of the family, or his anyway. So on some level, he was able to, you know, understand something about the plight of Black and colored people to a degree, because of his own experiences. And those experiences were formed because he was supportive and he set up this incredible platform for yourselves.
Yeah, and I mean, he had been part of the ANC for years before he became, you know, this guy that started YFM. So it's not like, you know, oh, here's this white guy and he had an idea to start a station and everything kind of happened in a bubble. There was a series of events that happened that led him to that place. Like, I honestly feel like that was his purpose in life, to start this station. And there were so many, events in the lead up in his own life that allowed him to start the station. So, I mean, he took it upon himself as a young white person in the 70s. I mean, his family is extremely wealthy. So they had an expectation of him kind of getting into the white corporate world, which is something that he completely rebelled against. And that's only because he actively took it upon himself to educate himself during that crazy time in apartheid, on what apartheid was and how it was, destroying Black people's lives. And he decided to, say, hey, I don't want to be part of this, but like actively not be part of this. So, I mean, he spoke about how, he would go and attend court hearings because, during the I would say early 70s, he would go and attend these trials of, Black people who are now, being forced to go to prison because they're trying to rebel against apartheid. And a lot of the families that attended could not afford to then go home. They didn't have transport to go back home from the courts, and he would help them get back home. And one of those families was Steve Biko's family. So, I mean, it's way back from then. And even the way he describes how he really wanted to get into the ANC underground because it was banned at the time. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could see that this person had, huge empathy for what was happening in the country at the time. And he even changed what he was studying to I think he then had his honors degree in Black consciousness, as a white person. And he moved because his parents forced him to go to Stellenbosch University, which is a predominantly Afrikaans, very, very verkramp. Okay, it's an Afrikaans word, but like, they don't even like English speaking people, okay?
Hey, wow.
English speaking white people is a no-no, especially back then. And he's English speaking. So he then left Stellenbosch and went to UCT because it was more progressive and a little bit more English. And that's when he decided to, major in Black consciousness. And I mean, from there, I mean, his life is just an insane experience. But just to sum it up, from there, he basically helped to start one of South Africa's biggest trade unions, which is now COSATU, because, during apartheid, Black people were not allowed to convene in groups because that is a threat, and definitely not be part of a union. And he had worked in white unions, he had worked in Indian unions, he had worked in colored unions. And through all that experience, he's obviously a very empathetic man. I mean, he is a writer. He has a writing background. He's a journalist.
What is his name? I don't think we've mentioned his name, actually. I can't. What is
Dirk?
His name?
So his name is Dirk Hartford.
Because I was thinking, I said he, and there was a guy, and I'm like, I don't think.
Dirk Hartford, yes.
Brilliant. And so, therefore, so there's so much there, which then brings into your documentary, the music, the radio stations, the impact on your life personally, but also the impact on youth generally. I mean, to say that they never had a voice, they never had an outlet.
No, absolutely.
This was
so,
really
I mean, cool. Yeah. And I mean, and all of these musicians, even the DJs, I mean, they were all part of. So, I mean, a lot of them were born around 1976 or just before 1976. But I think what's also not known from our history is that in 1986, there was a state of emergency. So townships were locked down. Like, when I mean lockdown, I mean military went in there and kids couldn't leave and kids couldn't come in. Like, basically that was their life. But I mean, a lot of violence happening at the time. So, I mean, yes, there was that massive uprising in 1976 of youth where they were marching and so many of them got killed. And then there is a famous photograph with Hector Peterson being carried, and that became like a symbol of what was happening in SA. But I mean, the struggle didn't end there. It was like, more than 10 years later during the 80s and still in the lead up right into the 90s. before the election, there was still so much violence. So I mean, these guys who then ended up being DJs and musicians, they were part of that 1986 lockdown, that's the state of emergency, and they were forced as young people to participate in this, you know, defense against the military that was in their townships. So I mean, they were taught how to use guns. They were taught how to use AK-47s. I mean, seeing a dead body in the road was like normal every day going to school. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is brilliant, because your documentary, and you are a filmmaker, I don't care what you say. The thing is, it doesn't matter whether you finished it, you've started. And all the history that you've just shared, Suzanne, has fed into that. And it's pivotal and it's powerful. And what is the message you would like people to take away from your documentary? I mean, other than the obvious, but your personal message to humanity, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think having, you know, interviewed all of these people from that time, you know, and having kind of been an observer and participant in that time as well, you know, I can just say that, I mean, apartheid was the biggest menace force in the history of the world. I mean, it is the equivalent to the Holocaust, but we're talking about years and years and decades and decades. I mean, even the origin of apartheid go way back. We're talking hundreds of years here. And yet, you know, when apartheid fell, despite all of that harm, despite all of that violence, whether it be physical, mental, you know, institutional, there were these group of people that still went on and created music out of it. Like, music? Are you kidding me?
But music is an expression. But
yes,
music is one of those things that touches each and every emotion, from whether you're depressed, you're angry, whether you're happy, it touches everything. And so it's a fantastic expression, and one that is international. It can weave its way internationally, because behind that also it was a message. There were messages in it.
But I think what's even more amazing for me is that, and this is what I think people are finding so difficult these days, is like, whatever pain you've been through in your life, you can take that and harness it. And whether it is starting a radio station, because I mean, the people who then became part of this radio station, they had come through a lot of pain, all of them, even people like Dirk. So, I mean, even the person that was the co-founder, he came also from a completely different background to Dirk, in that his perception on Black people then changed, you know, and he was seen as someone who betrayed his community, so his white community, you know. And I mean, like, I think that's the trick to life, is to kind of take all of your experiences, whether it's painful or not, and harness it in a way that then, you know, benefits you. And because it's benefiting you, it's benefiting everybody. Yes. You know? Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's the power of the story, is like, you know, take your pain, harness it, and make something great out of it. Maybe not at the time, it doesn't feel like it, but there is potential for everyone to do that.
Excellent. And in a sense, you know, what sort of winding down, in a sense, you know, your journey, how long has it taken for you to get to this stage? And just do share a little bit more about your recent information or celebration.
Well, I mean, I must say, I was looking at some of because I mean, most of filmmaking is a lot of proposal writing. It is trying to make the film, but it's also, you know, all those proposals and pictures that you put together. And I try to go as far, I mean, I was going through a whole bunch of stuff, and I looked at a date, and I think it was like the middle of 2014. Because I came to the Sheffield Doc Fest to come and pitch there. So that was 2014. And the ITFA Amsterdam, which is in Amsterdam, the ITFA Documentary Festival. So, I mean, that was in 2014. But yes, what a long road from development through to production. And now I finally have got post-production funding, which means I am on deadline to finish this film next year.
Excellent. Excellent, excellent. You know, Suzanne, you know, what you've shared has been inspiring on so many levels. And I'm, you know, talking to someone who had this lived experience, you know, that in itself is to be commended. And, you know, very sort of last words around your documentary. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about it? That I mean, you've given us, we've looked at the trailer and you've given us, you know, a broad view of, you know, why. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us about your documentary, The Why Revolution?
Well, I'm very excited for the international community to see this film. I think it's a contemporary story about South Africa. I think, you know, it's by time that we celebrate what we've done so far post-democracy.
Absolutely.
I mean, it hasn't been easy. It's still not easy. We're still making mistakes. We're still young. We're still all of that. But I mean, within that, I think, you know, this particular group of people that I'm kind of shining the story on, the people behind the radio station, the musicians, you know, behind the music, they haven't really been celebrated. And I'm hoping the international community will help celebrate them.
Excellent. Yeah. They can do that through you because you are shining the spotlight on them. And you've got to start someplace. So thank you so much for that. Well, ladies and gents, I've just been talking to Suzanne Du Toit. No, that's not Du Toit. I can get it.
No, it's not Du Toit. It's Du Toit.
I know. I wanted to put a French spin on it. Leave me alone. Suzanne Du Toit.
It's those French colonialists that came here and gave me that surname.
And even when you say apartheid, I love the way you've got this sort of clipped way, you know.
So I mean, apartheid is Afrikaans. Yeah, so I mean, when you Afrikaans is quite a hard language. So yeah, I mean, I know like the English version is apartheid.
That's right. Yes, that's what I've been saying.
Apartheid.
Apartheid. Okay, so you know, apartheid. That's it. Yeah, and Suzanne Du Toit.
Yes,
as a bit of some lessons for me today. But ladies and gents, just want to say look out for her upcoming documentary. And Suzanne, where can people find out more about what you're doing? Have you got your online presence?
Yes, I'm on Facebook with my name, Suzanne Du Toit. I'm also on Instagram. But I mean, as soon as the film is nearing its ending process in production, you will see the platforms. Yeah. I will send it to you. You can send it out.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time. We actually got this done, and wishing you all the best. And I'm looking forward to seeing your documentary.
Yes,
Adam,
thank you. Thank you.
Frames worn by Esther on the show today are sponsored by Run It First.